Last night outside the House of Commons. This morning, Jacob Rees Mogg, the Leader of the Commons, is sitting in the studio in Westminster. Good morning to you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on as you come to the end of your very distinguished service on the Today programme. There is always a frisson in being interviewed by somebody who interviewed Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson in their pomp. So thank you for having me on.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Now, tell us about this, since we're in a friendly mood, tell us about your chat with the Queen yesterday morning. How did it go?
I'm not allowed to, as you know.
I knew you would say that.
But aren't we lucky to have the sovereign that we've got and to have a constitutional monarchy? It is one of the great things about being British.
Well, in that case, you shouldn't have put her in such an awkward position, because Lord O'Donnell, Gus O'Donnell, former head of the Civil Service, said you had put her in, I quote, a very difficult position.
That's simply wrong and deeply irresponsible of him to say that. That the Queen, Her Majesty, had no discretion over this. There is no precedent for the Queen refusing a request by her Prime Minister under these circumstances. This is a straightforward decision by the Prime Minister giving formal advice to the Sovereign, which a constitutional monarch is obliged to follow. Even if you look at dissolutions, in all normal circumstances, the Sovereign is obliged to follow that advice prior to the 2011 Act. So Lord O'Donnell is saying things that are damaging to the Constitution and wrong.
You say she is obliged to follow. Is she allowed, or obliged even, you might say, I suppose, to ask questions? When you say, Your Majesty, will you please do this, or however you phrase it, is she then obliged to say, justify it?
The Bagehot formula is that the Sovereign is to be consulted and is allowed to encourage and to warn. And that is, as we understand it, what takes place in the audiences that the Prime Minister has of Her Majesty, normally on a weekly basis. But the Sovereign then has to follow formal advice from the Prime Minister, and only the Prime Minister can give what you might call capital A advice to the Queen. So absolutely, to be consulted, to encourage and to warn, but not to put obstacles in the path.
You've made it clear you won't say what she told you, and people will understand that, I'm sure, because that is confidential. But did she ask any questions? Did she raise any concerns?
I can tell you the way the Privy Council operates, because this is public knowledge. What happens is that as Lord President, I read out a statement as to what has happened. So yesterday, for example, I read out that James Cleverly was to become a member of the Privy Council, and the Queen says approved. That's it. There is no chat, there's no debate, it's all held standing up. So it's a very formal process.
And the same when you said the Prime Minister wishes to prorogue, etc., she will just say approved.
That's absolutely right. And it's important that people understand that this is a prime ministerial decision. It is not a decision of the Sovereign, and hasn't been. Well, it's arguable about how involved earlier sovereigns were, but certainly hasn't been the position of the Sovereign in this reign. And
what about the wish by Jeremy Corbyn and indeed Joe Swinson, Liberal Democrat leader, to have a meeting with the Queen? They've requested that meeting, apparently.
They really ought to go back and do the ABC of the Constitution. If Mr Corbyn wants to have an audience of Her Majesty, he needs to win a vote of confidence in the House of Commons to say that he ought to lead this country.
Under any circumstances, he couldn't just, as leader of the opposition, say, look, this is a matter of huge importance to a very, very large number, to the entire nation, indeed.
No.
Surely it's fitting that I should have a wee chat with the Queen just to give her an idea of what we think.
No, because that would confuse the situation. That the Queen is not in a position where she can pick and choose the advice she takes. I mean, she can't listen to the Today programme and think John Humphreys has got it right. I'm sure she does do this, probably every morning. But constitutionally, she's not allowed to do that. She cannot have any formal capital A advice from anybody other than the Prime Minister. And for the leader of the opposition or the leader of the Liberal Party to pretend that they can give advice is wrong. If they want to give advice, then they must put down a vote of no confidence, they must win that, and then they must win a vote of confidence for one or other of them to be Prime Minister. And then they can see the Queen whenever they want, because the Prime Minister has a standing right of audience.
Right, let's talk about what you have done. The length of the prorogation, which is upsetting so many people. The Hansard Society, authoritative body in this respect, says a gap of 5 weeks is the longest suspension of the British legislation since 1945. Why did it have to be that long, unless you were trying to steamroller something through?
simply because of the conference recess. The number of sitting days that is lost is in line with the averages going back to the Second World War. So, yes, because of the 3.5 weeks of conference recess, it is 5 weeks in total.
There is a very simple way to deal with that, isn't there? And that is to say, let's not have the conferences this year, because we could ask ourselves, couldn't we, what is more important, the future of this nation in Europe or out of Europe, or a few politicians getting together at the seaside or wherever it happens to be for a bit of a chat?
Well, that's always true, that should Parliament sit or should we have conferences?
We're seldom in a situation like this, are we? This is a national crisis.
But the law has been passed for us to leave on the 31st of October. And there will be time to debate any deal that is come to after the European Council. Bear in mind, the European Council isn't until the 16th, 17th of October. So if there is any agreement, it won't be until after that. And then there is a period of 13 days, and Parliament could conceivably sit for the whole of that time to debate the implementation of any agreement or any other matters it wished to. So the time for debating the agreement or the non-agreement is after that point has been reached, which we haven't got to. The time for debating the law on leaving the European Union has already been and gone. We've passed the Withdrawal Act, we passed the Article 50 Act, and of course the Referendum Act that opened the way to all of this. So there's no pressing legislative issue relating to Brexit that would interrupt the party conferences.
Well, there is an enormous issue, isn't there? And that is that you want a no-deal. Well, I say you are perfectly prepared to have a no-deal Brexit. Many people believe that would be catastrophic for this nation. And during the prorogation period, MPs not only cannot try to pass legislation or call a confidence vote, but select committees which hold ministers to account cannot meet. Reports can't be issued. So you're shutting down, effectively, you are shutting down Parliament's ability to stymie a no-deal Brexit.
Select committees very rarely meet during parliamentary recesses.
But these are, unusual, unprecedented times.
Well, everything's always unprecedented.
Well, I know, but come on, we've never been here before, have we?
We've never been leaving the European Union before. That is true. But actually our constitution works extraordinarily well and is able to cope with issues of this kind. And it is important to get a new Queen's speech and get on to the other business of government, which has been neglected for the last 3 years. And in terms of what you're saying about people want to stop no deal, actually, what they really want is for us not to leave the European Union.
Well, some do, but there are many who don't. I mean, to say that...
Can you point to a single person who voted leave who is now saying we mustn't have no deal?
Do I have to do that?
Well,
are you? Let me turn the question on you, if I may. That is my job, after all.
Fair enough.
Why is it unlikely that people who voted to leave the European Union are not now saying to themselves, but actually, you know what, I assumed there would be a deal because that's what we kept being told. It's pretty likely that is the case, isn't it?
I mean, if you follow, as I'm sure you do, Sir John Curtis,
indeed,
his polling indicates, and his analysis of his polling indicates that basically people haven't changed their mind since the referendum, regardless of the arguments about deal or no deal. And that the people who are banging on about no deal, and the sort of candy floss of outrage that we've had over the last 24 hours, which, to go back to our introduction, I think is almost entirely confected, is from people who never wanted to leave the European Union. And you must bear in mind that this is the greatest period of anger for them, or of confected anger, because after the 31st of October we will have left, and this is the last time that they have available to try and thwart the 17.4 million people who voted to leave.
Bleak assessment of your colleagues, isn't it? I mean, we have Philip Hammond, former Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Never wanted to leave and obstructed.
Never wanted to, but nonetheless, look at the sorts of things he is saying. Constitutional outrage, profoundly undemocratic. Dominic Grieve, deeply questionable, frankly outrageous. Michael Heseltine, constitutional outrage. John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons. Well, I could go on. You know the list as well as I do.
Let's deal with Lord Heseltine and the Speaker, because what they had to say is, of course, interesting. Lord Heseltine, as Deputy Prime Minister, was party to a 19-day suspension of Parliament prior to the 1997 general election. So it wasn't a constitutional outrage then. It is now. I think that's confected anger. Mr. Speaker's interesting because the Speaker, by convention and long-standing tradition has no tongue with which to speak or eyes with which to see other than as directed by the House. What he said yesterday was not directed by the House and therefore must be said in a personal capacity, not as Mr. Speaker.
Was it, I was going to use the word illegal, not the appropriate word, but was it improper?
It was the most constitutionally improper thing that happened yesterday.
What about this quote? I am not attracted to arcane procedures such as prorogation. Now, you'll approve of the chap who said that because it was one Boris Johnson, and that is what he said during the leadership contest. So what changed for him since then?
I approve everything that our great Prime Minister says. I think it's the context of what he was saying, that there was a discussion during the leadership election that Parliament would be suspended from July through to the 1st of November. And this is the arcane bit, this is the archaic mechanisms that he also referred to, because Elizabeth I used these mechanisms to keep parliaments going, to bring them back when it was convenient, to suspend them and so on and so forth, and sometimes had prorogations lasting for years. That's the arcane mechanism. The Queen's Speech, new session of Parliament, is a completely routine part of our constitution. It's not archaic, it's not arcane, it normally happens every year.
Well, he's just finding another device to achieve the same effect, isn't he?
No, he's not. I think the new Queen's Speech is actually, we're focusing too much on the end of one session rather than on the beginning of the new session. We're focusing on the past rather than the future. The new session will allow us to set out the really exciting plans that the government has. So we'll be able to bring forward legislation on the health service, on knife crime, on improving...
But that, as you well know, is irrelevant to what we're talking about this morning. You would do that anyway. That is the whole point.
No, sorry, I hate to correct you and do so with great diffidence, but it can't be done anyway because we are at the end of a session and you cannot introduce complex new legislation at the end.
You do it in the next session then.
But then to have a next session you need to prorogue Parliament.
Yes,
so that's the point.
But it's the timing of the prorogation that matters. And look, what many people do, they believe two things. One is that you're trying to railroad this a no-deal Brexit through Parliament, and the other is that inevitably, and this is something that Boris Johnson apparently does want, you can tell me whether this is the case or not, he would rather like another election. And what we may well see as a result of all this is that there will be a vote of confidence, which you might very well lose, and therefore there will be a general election. That is, I was going to use the word inevitable. That's too strong. It's highly likely, isn't it?
I think that there are two separate points there. I don't think there's any attempt to railroad. That bear in mind that the law of the land is that we leave the European Union, and Parliament voted for that on the back of a referendum where 17.4 million people voted to leave. That's not railroading. That's delivering a proper constitutional settlement. On the general election, since the 2011 Fixed-Term Parliament Act, which I consistently opposed when it was going through Parliament because I never felt it fitted with the grain of our constitution, but never mind, it's the law that we've got. It is no longer in the Prime Minister's gift as to whether there is an election or not, but no Prime Minister ever wants to lose a vote of confidence. That is not a good thing to do.
Jacob Rees Mogg, thank you very much.
Mr. Humphreys, thank you.